My name's Peter Sterios, and home is San Luis Obispo, California. Yoga found me by a rather ordinary, actually, experience of walking by a rec center fitness room back in the early 70s and seeing a bunch of women, doing yoga and not having any idea what they were doing, but just there was something that piqued my interest. And it wasn't just because there was a room full of women. It was just the shapes they were creating with their bodies was like, what is that? I want to try that. And back in those days, it was not cool to be a guy going to a yoga class. So I got a lot of jokes at my expense from the friends that I played sports with, that I would be going to yoga after, practice and I just kept at it, but it wasn't so much a commitment, it was more out of convenience, and if it fit with my time schedule, I would go, and if I was busy, I wouldn't go, and there would be months where I didn't practice. So for, I would say, 5 years, my relationship to yoga was very casual, and because of that, I had no desire to do anything other than just the physical workout. And I would, actually all of my teachers up until that point were young women that, had a spiritual background, let's say, and they would talk a lot during class about the spiritual aspects of yoga, but I wasn't interested in that. I was just interested in getting flexible hamstrings. And that, for 5 years, that was it. That was probably the only expectation I had out of yoga. I was getting more flexible. I was getting stronger in a different way. I was weight training a lot at the time, but I noticed that because of the increase in flexibility, I had more strength. The sports that I played, I was actually, stronger in the way I was doing those sports. And then through an invitation to go to New Zealand, I played rugby in New Zealand for several years, and I realized as the second year approached that this sport was going to probably make me a very old man if I kept playing at a very young age. So I stopped because I had so many joint injuries from those days of rugby. And literally 2 weeks after I quit playing rugby, I was walking by an elementary school on my way to work in Wellington, New Zealand, and I saw a flyer for a workshop, and the workshop was from a man, and it was just like, wow, what's this? A man doing yoga. And the picture on the flyer caught my attention too, because it was just an extreme pose, and there was again that curiosity. How does that happen? How do you get to be a man that flexible and able to achieve that? And so that, again, on just a purely physical level, I was drawn to that workshop. And it turned out to be Shandor, who I ended up, that first weekend workshop was profound on many levels. One, it was a workshop with a man who was speaking the language of an athlete, he was a soldier in the Vietnam War. He had these ways of communication that were direct and make things happen. And he rarely talked about the spiritual during practice. He would talk about detail in the practice. And then he would save the kind of philosophical talks for after practice. And that was perfect because usually after practice I was pretty tired and I'd probably doze off during the philosophical stuff anyway. So for me it was a perfect weekend, and I was hooked. And every time he would come to New Zealand, I would travel. If he was in Auckland, I'd go up to Auckland. If he was in Christchurch, I'd fly down to Christchurch. And we had this great relationship, just teacher-student relationship. But at one point, I was deciding that it was time to leave New Zealand, and he had planted the seed in me about going to India. And he told me about his teacher at the time, Iyengar, and I was intrigued. And I basically said, well, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. What can you help me with? And in those days, you had a 2-year wait list to get into the institute, and you really had to know someone to actually get accepted to go in. And I didn't have any wait list priority, and I just said, can I just show up? And he said, okay, I'll tell you how to show up and get in. And it just so happened that it was during the 70th birthday celebrations for BKS, and there was a lot of flexibility, let's say, in some of the rules during that time that the school manager had at his disposal, and he let me in, which was, in hindsight, a miracle to me, that I just showed up and I got in, and that was universe telling me there's something here for me to learn. And I was planning on staying a month, and I ended up staying a year. And that was when, you know, Shandor had stimulated the curiosity and passion, let's say, for yoga, but it was that year in India that yoga transformed me. It completely shifted my body. I lost, you know, probably 30 pounds from my rugby weight down to a manageable weight that, as a yogi, I find very useful. And the philosophy that I would get in classes outside asana started to make sense to me. I think my practice had developed to a point where it was something that was interesting to me. And when I left India, I was changed. And I remember going to Europe and visiting friends in Europe, and they almost didn't recognize me. And, you know, what happened to you in India kind of thing. And it was hard for me to describe what happened. I wasn't even that clear how it happened, really. I was just different. My relationship to myself and to life was different. So that's what kind of lit the fire into my practice. And when I got home, I had no intention of teaching. But then, you know, friends wanted me to teach them, and then, you know, more people started wanting to be taught. And I ended up renting a community center hall from the city of San Luis Obispo, where I was living. And that first location, you know, within no time, I was teaching 3 classes a week out of that. And okay, I guess I'm a teacher. And I never would have guessed that my destiny would have been yoga teacher because of my background, my family life growing up. But here I am. If I look at the major events in my life, there's what I consider positive, you know, good events, and so-called negative or bad events. And the black mat entered my life in a kind of previous incarnation, previous form. The Shandor would teach in Germany, and every year he'd come and he'd have these different mats. And one year he showed up at my house in San Luis Obispo, and he had this thick black mat. And I said, what is that? You know, and I want one of those. And he said, okay, here's the phone number in Frankfurt. His name was Klaus. Here's Klaus's phone number. Give him a call. And that night I called Klaus, and he picked up the phone, and I said, hey, Klaus, I'm Shandor's friend. You know, how can I get a mat? And he said, well, you have to buy about $2,500 worth of mats to get a mat. And I was, you know, building a house and running a business, and I was in debt, and where am I going to get that kind of money? And it was at a time when credit was really easy to get, and I just signed up for like 10 credit cards, and I got all of them and wrote convenience checks for the whole amount. And so the mats show up on my doorstep, you know, and like, not on my doorstep, in my driveway. It was like 9 pallets of mats. And I'm going, what am I going to do with all these mats? And I mean, I was wanting to sell them out of my studio, but San Luis is small. And then I had the idea, well, why don't I just give a bunch away to all my celebrity yoga teacher friends and see what they think? And that's what I did. So I gave one to Rodney Yee and Eric Schiffman. And Eric, he got the first one, and he said, no, I want a longer mat. I'm big. Can you get the factory to make a 100-inch long mat? And for years, we produced this 100-inch, we never called it the Eric Schiffman, but I think he had the name that stuck. It was the Runway to Enlightenment. And that was funny. I had big men, mostly men, ordering these 100-inch long yoga mats. But eventually the factory was kind of upset that I was selling so many of these, so we cut it back down to 85 inches. And literally the early days of Manduka were just selling one product because it was easy. and the mat was good, but it wasn't great. And at one point, the architect in me said, I think we can make this mat better. I went to Germany, I set up a meeting, I flew to Frankfurt, I met in the factory, they gave me a tour, and I saw these other products in their product line that were non-yoga related, and I said, can we use that texture on this mat on the top and this texture on the bottom? I think it'll make them more stable, more durable, you know. And sure enough, they had a really smart chemist in their factory, and they put this thing together. And the thing that intrigued me about this mat, and the reason that I committed to it so much, is that it never wears out. And back in the day, we didn't have the lifetime guarantee, but for me, it was like, this is the echo statement that I want to make. You buy one mat for the rest of your life. And all the business coaches at that time that I was talking to said, that's a mistake. You don't want to sell something that never wears out. Otherwise, you're never going to make any money. And that was one of those intuitive things that came to me, and I said, no, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm going to do. And this is how it happened. This was right when the internet was launching. So I sent all these mats to all these celebrity teachers. And Eric especially, I would know when Eric was teaching a weekend workshop in Nashville, Tennessee, because on Monday morning, I'd have 25 orders for a black mat off our website. And I was like, what's going on in Nashville? And then I'd check his website, and Eric Schiffman teaching in Nashville. And he told me once that he'd start every workshop by saying, okay, I'm going to get this out of the way. This is the best yoga mat ever. If you're serious about yoga, just go email Peter and have him send you one. So that was the beginning of the company. And for years, that's all we had is one product. And yeah, the architect in me got bored with the one product, so I started doing other things. And it is what it is now. The relationships that I have with my students and relationships that I have with fellow teachers is one of the most important aspects of what I do as a yoga teacher. And I think I should share, you know, my teaching career was in a way sidetracked. There was a little detour in my focus with Manduka. And as Manduka started to grow, I started to teach less and less. I started to practice less and less. And the travel that I'd been doing for Yoga Journal and stuff, I had to stop because I just couldn't go away for a week to teach at a conference. So as that deterioration, let's say, of my ability to travel and teach and focus on, you know, running the business, I noticed that the growth in the workshop industry and the conference and festival industry started to grow. And as I would observe some of the teachers, the pictures, and I could just energetically read into these pictures and see the exhaustion in these faces, these pictures. And for me, it was like, that looks like vata derangement to me, you know, like too much road travel, too much hotel accommodation, too much restaurant food, whatever. And in a way, I kind of missed that first wave. And when I started to wind down Manduka, my involvement in Manduka, there was this 8 years of kind of pent up desire, let's say, to teach. And so as I started thinking about teaching again on a bigger global level, I thought, how can I do this where it sustains me instead of depletes me? How can I somehow be mindful in all the travel? And what I came up with, I think has worked, is I only go to places where I know someone, where I have a relationship with either the owner of the studio or a senior teacher at the studio, or sometimes it's just a group of students that I met at a festival or a conference that just bring together all their friends and say, come. And what I find about that arrangement is the money's nice, but what's better, what's more sustainable is the laughter, the jokes, the watching, you know, YouTube funny videos at night and having that exchange, which, you know, there's obviously some, let's say, sacrifices with my family who's left back at home when I'm traveling, but in general, that energy that's shared with me and the care that people give me as a teacher really makes the travel wonderful. And I watch what I eat, let's say, a little bit, and for me, it's great. And as the places that I get invited to, like here, there's having the beach right here. It's a place where I can invite my family in the future because they'll be entertained. And ideally, that's my goal: is maybe travel a little bit less, stay a little bit longer in places, and bring my family with me. And that would be my ideal scenario. So this whole notion of yogis being ascetics and the struggle of being a householder yoga teacher or yogi, to me, it is one of the most challenging things there is. And frankly, I know a lot of teachers that have families and have children, and when I listen to them talk about their experiences, I realize that it's easy to be an ascetic yogi. It's, when I was practicing as a single man with no responsibility to a spouse or no responsibility to a child, let's say the philosophy of yoga that I was spewing at the time, it was, I don't know, it wasn't real. To me, it's this householder yogi who's dealing with life on a daily basis and then trying to integrate this inward practice at the same time. And ultimately, they come together, and this is something that I never read in any book about householder yogis, is really if you can master that integration of your daily life, your family and household responsibilities, with a practice and contemplative time in study and meditation, that's interesting to me, and it's to this day still a challenge, but I'm drawn to other teachers and hanging out with peers that have that experience, and I find less and less that there's connection that I have with teachers that don't have that experience. And what has become obvious to me is I'm tired a lot of the time, and we have this negative connotation with being tired. I can think of even recently, working, being with family in the evening, having architecture projects still that I do, mostly for yoga retreat centers all over the world, having a deadline to have this drawing in the internet, email. We're staying up till 3 a.m. and I have to teach a 6 a.m. yoga class, which I do in my local studio. And when you go to a yoga practice, morning yoga practice with 3 hours of sleep or less, you're definitely a little foggy mentally, but because you haven't slept much, the stiffness that you usually get in the mornings in your joints and muscles doesn't exist. So you have this minus, let's say, of a little fogginess in the brain, but your body is so open. And as you start to breathe, even the fatigue of being tired doesn't seem to be an issue. The mind is a little slow to respond to the inner invitation to move deeper, but I find there's a positive side to working with no sleep. It's not something I'd want to do a lot, but I don't tell a story to myself, oh, I can't practice in the morning because I only got 2 hours sleep. No, I can practice, and I can modify my practice. And this actually relates to people, and myself included. When you have an injury, when a student has an injury and I don't see them for 3 weeks, and I run into them and I say, well, where have you been? And they say, I have this locked up shoulder. And I said, well, what have you been doing? Oh, just doing physical therapy. And I said, no yoga? And oh, no, it hurt too much. And I said, well, how about doing yoga for a locked shoulder? What does that look like to you? And oh, yeah, right. It's almost like I can't practice yoga unless I'm healthy. No, actually, yoga is there for when you're out of balance, you're injured, you're working through some kind of health opportunity, let's say, and yoga has to modify. You have to modify what you're practicing when you have these temporary limitations. In the early days of my yoga practice, and I was an architect by profession, I saw these two practices as distinctly separate. But the more I did yoga, the more I realized the strong relationships between architecture and yoga. And architecture school in the same way that Iyengar yoga for me, when I went to Pune and went to a yoga school, they had very precise ideas about what good form was. This is both architecture and yoga. What good form was, what was efficient structure, what was beautiful space. You know, the language was amazingly similar. And even what I experienced in architecture school in my first few years of architecture practice is I had these ideals from architecture school that I tried to, in a way, force feed into my clients. They, you know, for instance, they might want to, gee, I'd really like a hot tub in my bedroom, or, you know, some crazy idea like a hot tub in my kitchen, whatever. And because of that traditional architectural training, I would, you know, try to guide them into, you know, a private zone in the house and a public zone in the house. And yoga, in Iyengar yoga, was the same. They had this precise way of doing a yoga asana pose, and it was like one size almost fits all. That was my experience of it, and maybe that's different for different Iyengar practitioners, but for me that was my experience, and I had these things. And what I learned as an architect as I got older, and especially in the last 3 or 4 years, that oftentimes there is such wisdom in what the client is telling me that I hadn't thought about, and I just have to make space for what their input is so that I can then work with that and try and fit that into what I feel is the best solution budget-wise and the best solution aesthetically. And then as I've gotten more successful at that, I've realized that what results is something I would have never come up with by myself. And so that's an incredible beauty and advantage, let's say, of just listening to the client, listening to my own intuition, respond to their input, and then manifest in something. Now, that describes exactly what I've been teaching in these episodes with Levity Yoga, is that I'm guiding my students to, and the viewers, to listen to the resistance in their bodies. And instead of trying to apply this external form through rules of alignment and, you know, technique-oriented movement, is to just soften into that resistance and create space internally. And how? By surrender of effort, while maintaining this minimal amount of extension in the spine. That's the key. It's not just flopping, it's releasing and then listening and extending and finding what the body finds will allow you in. And then taking that feedback on the next cycle of breath and applying that feedback to the movement if you're going deeper, if you're coming out, if the pose is over, and save it for the next day. And ultimately, for me, that's been this aha moment, let's say, when I see the parallels of my two careers coming right in, they coincide so perfectly. And coincide is such a powerful word to me, because if you look at the definition, you know, from the Latin, coincide means two things that fit perfectly together. And yet in the English language, we've somehow kidnapped the definition of coincide to mean something that's so rare, it happens, you know, and it's just unusual. But really, to have this synchronicity, to me, is the way universe works. And through the practice of yoga, it's given me more space to see from a distance, stepping back from my own personality, stepping back from my life, and watching the patterns that universe provides. And I don't know why universe works in these ways. Part of me wants to think it's just entertainment. You know, life might be pretty boring on Earth if we didn't have life to keep us entertained. So, yeah, I'm inspired by architecture right now because of the quality of the client that's attracted to me, mostly because they know I do yoga. And I'm also inspired by the students that are showing up for my classes, both at home and on the road. So the process of listening, you know, I'll relate this more to yoga right now, because the yoga part of my life is going through a real spurt of creativity right now. And I listen to the dialogue between being guided by universe and my ego saying, oh, that looks cool, I want that, and kind of accumulating, let's say building a resume, let's say collecting experiences so that my resume as a yoga teacher looks good for whatever, selling media, etc. And there is definitely in the commercial world of yoga that pull to have a huge Instagram following, have some dramatic yoga poses on Instagram. And because of the depth of the practice that I've had over 40 years, I feel drawn to say, oh, I can still do that kind of stuff. Let's do some of that stuff. And I've dabbled in that. I've got some pictures on Instagram now, and I get some response. But what I notice is it doesn't feed me, and it's in a way it's work. And what the listening is, for me right now, the listening is my path is eliminating the separation between work and life. And the more I listen, the more effortless that becomes. And it's trusting that. And trusting that things aren't always what they appear to be. That having 100,000 followers on Instagram or touching a community in some remote Midwest town of 20 people, what feeds me most is that face-to-face connection that frankly is getting a little lost in, especially at festivals where there's 150 people in the class and there's a teacher with 5 assistants. And oftentimes in those situations, the assistant's going around making adjustments and they're not even listening to the teacher, and you're trying to listen to the teacher, and it's a nightmare when you think about that's instruction, that's yoga. So it's listening and not fighting that, and moving with what appears to be this flow towards that, whatever that is. And I'm getting better at listening. It's helping simplify my life on many levels. And here's the thing that, in a way, I've said this in the past, but it applies to my own life. How do I know if the direction I'm going with my practice is serving me? Is I look at the quality of the relationships in my life. And it starts with the relationships in my immediate circle. And then it expands out to the relationships of the people that are attracted to what I'm expressing, let's say. And that feedback, and I joke about this sometimes, when I was a younger teacher where I hadn't deconstructed the ego as let's say, as far as I have now, the type of student that I was attracting, they were difficult students. They were, in a way, energy-sucking students that needed to be spoon-fed every little piece, otherwise they would be frustrated. But now what I've noticed is, especially in the last couple of years, is the students that are drawn to what I teach, to my classes, or what they read on a flyer on the internet, these are self-sufficient people in general, and they have understood the power of the intuition and the power of listening to something deeper inside than some external authority. And that makes my job super easy. It's like hanging out with friends, practicing together, and if you have a question about this, I've been there, I can help you with that. Or if I haven't been there, I can say, I know someone that's been there. Here's, and I love doing this. I love sending my students to other teachers, and especially as I meet teachers that have this same orientation, let's say, to inner practice, to personal practice, and not just external practice. So as I've spent time listening to my inner voices, and that's plural, what I've noticed is there's a loud voice and there's usually a softer, quieter voice. And the loud voice is usually present in my attention, in my consciousness, when I'm busy and when I'm moving a lot, when I'm doing a lot. And the quiet voice doesn't show its head until I'm still. When I find space in my life to be still, to enjoy a sunset, to enjoy a walk in nature, to enjoy just, laying on the couch and watching the fire burn in my fireplace. And in those moments, these little, inspirations, these little messages get placed. And when I get those messages, there's a lightness in my body. Physically, I feel lighter. Like, The loud voice, as convincing as the loud voice can be, if I just carry through with the future manifestation of what that message is, I rarely feel light. I feel heavy. I feel obligated. I feel like, I got to do more. And so it's not that I don't listen to the loud voice sometimes. I still do, but I'm suspicious of it. I don't respond to the loud voice immediately. When the soft voice, when it comes clear that I understand the message, I respond immediately. It supports or it shifts the direction that I'm going. I mentioned that I had a 20-year relationship with Shandor. And what I learned in that 20-year relationship was it's that commitment to one teacher that you resonate with is really important. And it provides a context, let's say, for transmission that operates on multiple levels, on the personal level, on the professional level, etc. At the end of my apprenticeship with Shandor, he essentially said, go away and don't come back. And that was a gift, actually. It didn't seem like it at the time, but it was a gift because it put me into a situation that I had to confront, maybe for the first time in my life. I'm walking this path by myself in a way. And, the relationship I had with my parents stopped when I was 18, and so I don't have a mommy and daddy to take care of me anymore. And so this idea of being on my own was frankly a little terrifying. And for several years, I struggled. And then I met a teacher by the name of Andre Lapa. And Andre had a huge influence on my life at the time, just with the creativity that he had in terms of shaping poses with his body. And it was, his influences included Vietnamese yoga and Tibetan yoga. And so the architect in me was like, God, those are cool forms. I want to move with that form. And I didn't have the intimate relationship that I had with Shandor, with Andre, but I got to spend time with him outside of class, and I learned a lot, but it was a short-term relationship, and I find at one point it was over, and there was no formal goodbye. It was just a separation, and that's the way life is sometimes. Andre was my last yoga teacher that has inspired me, really. I've been inspired by other people, but not in class. I had a meditation teacher named Richard Moss that was actually here in Ojai, and I made a 3-year commitment to his trainings in meditation, which was so perfect for the way I was teaching yoga at the time and has served me here. I also studied meditation in India with Goenka before he died, and Vipassana meditation had a profound influence on my yoga because I realized that every sensation in the body is temporary. Even these so-called terminal, let's say call them terminal pains. I have a bad hip, my dad had a bad hip, I'm always gonna have a bad hip. Or, in part of that mindset, it guarantees that you're gonna have a hip problem your whole life. But through Vipassana, and especially through Goenka's influence, I realized that if I just sat still, I could create space for whatever sensation I was feeling, and somehow the body integrated that, and the intensity of that sensation just faded away. And I've had this experience with so many of my injuries from sports that I know it works. And Goenka's influence on my ability to be patient with my body and with my reaction to what I'm feeling in my body it's serving me to this day. And then the last teacher that has had a profound influence on my life, frankly, is my wife. And even though, she's studying yoga with me, I'm studying in a way life with her, and the way she responds under stress, the way she takes in information and the way she processes information in a way that's most of the time non-reactionary. She has a beautiful way to create space around whatever shows up on her plate. And my culture, Southern European culture being Greek, in my family DNA, we're emotional. We're, throwing plates and dancing on tables and things like that. And I love that part of my culture, but it doesn't serve me that much as a yoga teacher. And I'm less of that now. When I'm talking with my hands, they rarely go above my head, If there was one thing that I could identify in my experience as a yoga practitioner or teacher, one thing to share, let's say, with people interested in yoga or teachers, new teachers that are just starting a yoga teaching career, is to practice as best you can accepting things as they are in the moment. And whatever shows up in the moment is, in a way, right where you need to be. And how do you respond in that moment? And my experience of that is, if, this genetic propensity as a man to fix, I notice that I've softened that. And whatever situation comes up, there is every situation that has come up, say, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's an opportunity to just observe it and take a few breaths. And then after several breaths, understand, am I seeing this situation correctly? And if there's an answer that comes back to me, if it's a difficult situation, the voice inside says, whatever influence you have on this situation, do it as softly as you can, with no expectation of the outcome. And that advice, let's say, you could apply to so many layers in your life. Your practice, when you meet resistance in your body, are you trying to push through it, stretch through it to make it go away? Or are you meeting it and accepting it as it is, but feeling how softly can you touch it physically? How softly can you touch it psychologically with compassion or empathy? And see if the body's inherent natural healing forces resolve it for you. And how that applies in your life once you get outside your yoga room or outside class, and you have these difficult experiences in life with your spouse, with your partners, with your work, with your boss, whatever it is. Can you touch that difficulty in the same way, physically and psychologically, as softly as you can? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the message is, this situation has reached its limit and it's time to move.